So hello, this is a very special video that I'm making. This is on the BARDO THODOL, which in the West is known as the Tibetan Book of the Dead. I will be reading to you excerpts from the translation by Robert A.F. Thurman, but I will be discussing as I go along and taking breaks from the narration. But please join me, because this is a very interesting book, because this does not just speak of death and dying, but this speaks of how you can look at life, how you can look at life through a new spectrum. This gives you the science to deal with death, because we are really afraid to speak about death in the culture we've created. So explore that facet, because that is a part of us, and it's really the ultimate truth that we have to experience in 3D. So let me give you a bit of contextual substance before I move on. So Tibetans, from the Tibetan culture, is a very old culture, and it's from this culture that we get the Tibetan Book of the Dead, which is actually known as the Book of Liberation through understanding in the between. Okay, that is actually what the book should be called, but it is known as the Book of the Dead, the Tibetan Book of the Dead, and that is a misnomer. So that's something to be aware of. There are other translations, there is one by W.H.Y. Evans Wentz, which actually started the misnomer. There are other versions, of course, Francesca Fremantle, and there's another one by Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche. But this book is very practical and very usable. So I am gonna read to you from here and also explain while I read. So the Tibetan Book of the Dead was written by the great Master Padmasambhava sometime in the 8th or 9th century. It was written for Indian and Tibetan Buddhists, and it was hidden. It was discovered by the treasure finder Karma Lingpa in the 14th century. Alright, now the main content of this book is about the experiences of the between. In Tibetan, this is called Bardo. And this between is the state between death and rebirth. If you are aware of this, and if you're initiated in this mystery, then you understand the sacred universe and the mandala, the mild and the fierce Buddhist deities. There are 100 of them, okay? So this is very important to understand how this book prepares you for not just death, but also for life. Okay, now let me get to reading the first chapter. It's part 1. It's called Preparations for the Journey. Now the first chapter essentially will deal with the history of Tibet. So Tibet was known as the land of snows, according to their own people. Okay, their recorded history dates back some, I think, 2,300 years, to the time of the Macedonian Greek Empire in the West, the Mauryan Empire in India, and the late Chow Empire in China. So Tibet, during its first 8 centuries, they were ruled by a military dynasty. They had an animistic religious system which was run by the priesthood of shamans. They were adept in divination, sorcery, and sacrifice. Now the whole idea that the royal family descended from the heavens, even they followed this polity, and the first 7 kings came down to rule on a magical ladder, which was hanging in space, up which they would return when their time had come to die. Due to some conflict in the palace, the 8th king cut the sky rope, and kings thereafter, like the pharaohs of Egypt, were interred in the large burial mounds along with possessions and companions. So that was a bit of an excerpt from the translation by Robert A.F. Thurman. Moving on to more from the book. The early dynasty was centered in the Yarlung Valley, a river valley running south from the eastward flowing Sangchu, the Brahmaputra, near present-day Setsang. Gradually over the centuries, the dynasty added tribes and territories to its domain, uniting the lords of neighboring kingdoms in a feudal military network. The tribes they unified were already tied by 3 main common bonds: their territory, language, and religious tendency. They all inhabited the approximately 1 million square mile Tibetan plateau, with an average altitude of 13,000 to 14,000 feet. Living successfully at such an altitude involves a complex physiological adaptation. To be comfortable there, you really have to be born there from a lineage long acclimatized. The Tibetan language belongs to the Tibeto-Burman language family, a family distinct from the Indic, Dardic, Turkic, Mongolian, and Sinitic language families of the surrounding lowland areas. Religiously, Tibetans tended to deify elements of nature, especially mountains and sky, and shared a complex set of rituals of sacrifice, divination, and propitiation of a diverse pantheon of underworld, landscape, and celestial deities. The high-altitude culture was distinguished from those around by its more spiritual orientation. So I take a pause here from the book. I want to explain to you that Tibet is probably one of the only cultures in the world that don't have a military, and they are predominantly a spiritual culture. Okay, now so why with the spiritual, discussing from the book, but not reading it this time because I think it's very interesting to discuss this. Now, in the hilly areas, lifespans are less because, of course, you understand the life there is fraught with danger. Okay, and of course you have in front of you this raw primal beauty of the mountains, and you are forced to a life of reflection and contemplation. Okay, now back to the book. Like most shamanisms, it sought mundane success, victory, health, wealth, and progeny. So this religion of the early Tibetans. Okay, during the period of military expansion, it seems to have focused on a cult of kinship run by shamanic adept priests. Since the king had descended from the heaven as a divinity on earth, he guaranteed power and order. The shamans assisted this order by inviting the king's descent, celebrating his presence, securing the cooperation of the deities in the heavens, lands, and underworld, and managing the transition from the old kings to the new. The shaman was required to travel to the land of the dead and back in order to gain personal experience of the period of chaos between reigns. His role was to draw on the power of chaos while keeping it in its place, assuring its continuing separation from the land of the living, the realm of order. Okay, so the shaman had a tremendous responsibility because he had to bring to us, or lay people, this experiences of these other realms, and he had to bring them to us and to integrate, to help us expand our awareness. That basically the Tibetan dynasty, they were quite successful, they ruled, and they were quite ferocious actually. The Chinese, the Turkish, the Mongolian, the Persians, and the Indic peoples, they were all quite scared of the Tibetans in the beginning when they were militaristic culture. But as they realized their spirituality, now this is interesting, and let me get back to the book about this. In the early 17th century, an emperor named Songtsen Gampo reached the militaristic empire's natural limits. So this was very important. They did not want to expand beyond whatever was necessary. They did not want to go into the lowlands and, desecrate those places, kill those people, and take over and spread their colonies. They did not want to do that. They did not want to move away from that high altitude. So there was no threat to the lowland people that Tibetans are going to come down and, take over. So this was important. This showed that they were traditionally spiritually minded. Okay. Now, back to this emperor. Songtsen Gampo, he basically began to transform the civilization, which was essentially a feudal militarism, and he made it something more peaceful, something more spiritual. He cultivated the moral outlook. Now, he basically sent his convoys and got Buddhism paraphernalia and books all the way from the Palas and the post-Gupta dynasties of India. Okay, he even got a lot of material from the Sang dynasty of China. So therefore, he began this systematic process of cultural adaptation. He sent a team of scholars to India to learn Sanskrit and create a written language for Tibetan. So therefore he was very important, because with this particular emperor, Songtsen Gampo began this Tibetan script. Now he married 9 princesses from different surrounding countries like Nepal, Tibet, and Nepal and Tang China. Okay, and that's why he got a lot of alliances. And he set up his new capital at Lhasa. Okay. For the next 2.5 centuries, his successors continued his work of cultural transformation, sponsoring translations, holding research conferences, building institutions, and educating their subjects. So this was all going very well, and so this is how they developed this Tibetan system, which actually comprised of all the systems of India, China, Persia, Mongolia, Uiguria. Okay, so the Tibetan medical system integrated the best available psychology, anatomy, neurology, surgery, botany, chemistry, and nutrition with Buddhist spiritual technology. So they were really great at this aspect. They were called psychonauts, but more on that later. After this high point of Samya's ascendancy, a period of confusion ensued. As with any civilization, we see after a certain golden age, we see a deterioration, and so there were a lot of coups, and there were a series of assassinations, and the dynasty collapsed. Okay. And within a century, however, Buddhist insights and institutions re-emerged, now rooted among the people, with sponsorship from regional rulers. For the next 3 centuries, Tibetans more and more turned their interest towards Buddhist education. and monasteries were built all over the country. The vast network of translation was completed, and a voluminous indigenous literature was developed. No new royal dynasty emerged to control the whole country. So this was great because there was a huge revival of scriptures, and this new system of Tibetan ontology came into being. The Tibetan system of knowledge came into being. During the 18th and the 14th centuries, the Mongolian Empire unified most of Eurasia, and Tibet was formally incorporated within Pax Mongolia. In reality, it was very little changed, divided into 13 main administrative regions, each run by a combination of a local ruling family and a local monastic hierarchy. The Sakya hierarchy and the Khan family were formally put in charge overall by Kublai Khan, but the Sakya hierarch was more of a spiritual figurehead than an active administrator. Toward the end of the 14th century, the Mongol Empire fell apart. In 1642, almost exactly 1,000 years after the building of the Jokhang Cathedral, His Holiness the Fifth Dalai Lama, 1617 to 1682, was crowned King of Tibet. Okay, so this is the Great Fifth. Sorry, that was not the Great Fifth. This is the Great Fifth. And this Great Fifth, he created this unique form of government which was suited to Tibet's special society, okay, the spiritual society. Now, the nobility was completely taken apart. The military was, of course, hacked to bits. Demilitarization happened, and the Dalai Lama became the ruler of the country. Okay, so Tibet was hidden away from the world. Okay, and not too many people were aware of the Tibetans and their culture. So China and the English both exploited this and kept the world away from Tibet, which is why we have this problem that we have today, actually. Let's get back to the book and discuss a bit about how Tibet is such a spiritual civilization. During the 3 centuries of Tibet's modern period, the national priority was on monastic education, literary and philosophical creativity. This is so interesting. Okay. The practice of meditation, the development of ritual and festival arts, and so forth. Spiritual adepts were accepted as the highest level of Tibetan society, considered to have become perfected Buddhas through their practice of the Tantras, which are the spiritual technologies of self-cultivation, which is called unexcelled yoga. They were inner world adventurers of the highest daring, the Tibetan equivalent of our astronauts. I think it is worth coining the term psychonaut to describe them. They personally voyaged to the furthest frontiers of that universe which their society deemed vital to explore, the inner frontiers of consciousness itself in all its transformations in life and beyond death. In Western culture, the last frontiers of our material conquest of the universe are in outer space. So this is very important to understand the difference between the West and the East. So when it comes to the West, everything is from without to within. Everything is experienced from the outside world. So there is a need to explore the outside world. But with Tibet, there's a need to explore the inner world, the inner universe, right? And that's what makes them psychonauts. They traverse the psyche, the unconscious. Okay, the Tibetan lamas who can consciously pass through the dissolution process, whose minds can detach from the gross physical body and use a magic body to travel to other universes. These psychonauts are the Tibetans' ultimate heroes and heroines. Psychonauts, they were also called tulkus, which are mind-born emanations. Okay, you can create tulkus, which become real entities, and you can meditate and create these tulkus. So the Tibetan civilization extremely unique on this planet, and there is an extremely interesting aspect to their civilization. Okay, because this stresses on inner modernity instead of outer modernity. Okay, which the West is so symbolic of. There is a connection of psychic or mental things with the physical world. Okay, they are not divorced. The modern Tibetan character complex shares the modern traits of individualism, openness, and flexibility of identity, reflectiveness, and rationality. This is the modern Tibetan character. So, but they also have this peculiar perception derived from the Buddha civilization of all things as infused with spiritual value, as interconnected with mental states. So this is in direct contrast to Western ideas. Tibetan view is that the mental or spiritual cannot always be reduced to material quanta and manipulated as such. The spiritual is itself an active energy in nature, subtle but more powerful than the material. So the Tibetans view this as a strong force in nature, which is spiritual and not material. So this is tremendously diverse to what the Western concept is. So I won't get into a huge history from the book here. We've understood the basic idea that they what they do right now. A bit here is interesting. Tibetan inwardly directed reason put the material world second on its list of priorities. Its prime concern was the world of inner experience, the waking, gross realm of causality, relativity, sensation, percept and concept, and the subtle realm of image, light, ecstasy, trance, dream, and finally death and its beyond. The Tibetans considered the inner, subtlemost experiential realm the most important, at which to assert control of all subjective and objective cosmic events. So they set about exploring this inner world using analytic insight and contemplative concentration to extend their awareness into every crevice of experience. They used the manipulation of dreams and inner visions to visit lucidly the territories of the unconscious. They used focus, disidentification with coarse subjectivity to gain access to the subtlest level of sentience. And they used an augmented sense of mindfulness and memory to gain access to past life experience, including the dreamlike experiences of the between states traversed from death to birth. So this is so very interesting that they journey into the psyche. That's what we also do with the tarot. We journey into the psyche. With astrology, we again journey into the psyche. Planets represent archetypes. So this is very, very, very interesting that if you study and delve into your inner universe, you actually learn about the exterior universe. So before moving on, I want to mention to you Tibet's present plight. If you don't know about it, please find out. I'm sure you know about it. We have to create awareness about Tibet and its situation. Now, because they don't have a military, this fact was exploited by the British and the Chinese to keep Russia away, but it's been really horrible because the Maoist government invaded Tibet in 1949, and they told the world that they were liberating their own country's Tibetan province from foreigners. Okay, and there were like hardly anybody there in Tibet at that time, foreigners there. This was horrible because the Tibetans considered Chinese people to be foreigners and they did not want to be liberated, you know. So this was horrible because China has broken a lot of monastery, destroyed a lot of scripture, and the genocide of 6 million Tibetans took place, and it's terrible, really. Now we've got to understand Buddhism in a nutshell before we can move on. So this book is called the Great Book of Natural Liberation Through Understanding in the Between. Okay, now you've got to understand that this is an approach, a Buddhist approach to death and dying. But it's not just for Buddhists, okay? It's a science. It's a science, and its extreme popularity can only confirm its status as a very effective tool to understand, as I have previously mentioned, not just a death but also life. So Buddhism is the teaching that originated in Nepal or India, wherever. It's actually Nepal, some 2,500 years ago. Now, this was based on revelation received by Buddha, but it was not from any deity. It was self-realization, okay? And Buddha means the awakened, and use the powers of reason and not to accept irrational traditions. So he was quite the revolutionary, the rebellious soul, the iconoclastic individual. He was an awakened individual, the enlightened person. Okay, because he achieved a perfect understanding of the nature and structure of reality. Human mind is he thought that the human mind was capable of reaching a full understanding of everything. Okay, but the correct education and heroic effort, okay, he could do anything. He or she could do anything. So this was his teaching, and it was the word dharma that the Buddha used to designate his truth or teaching. All right. Now, this created a new dimension to this word dharma, okay, which is from the verb to hold, dhar, to hold, dhara, dharani, and it has a range of important meanings associated with holding. So dharma, okay. Now the Buddha's dharma is very simple. It's broken up into two aspects, the textual and the experiential, and you always stressed on the experiential, of course. Hardcore ethical higher education, meditational higher education, wisdom higher education. That is what the experiential is broken up into. The textual is broken up into discipline collection, discourse collection, clear science collection. The Buddha taught the Dharma far and wide throughout India for over 45 years. So people, they really got on to this new teaching and they formed the Sangha, which is the community. And now there were loads of wandering monks, but Buddha actually was the first person who gave such profound wisdom to the common people. Now the three main aspects of Buddhism, they are the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. So that is teacher, teaching, and community, which are known as the three jewels of Buddhism, the three Ratna. And you have to understand these three most precious things if you want to get moksha, if you seek nirvana, if it's liberation that you seek, liberation from ignorance, from suffering. So this was the Buddha's key, the three jewels. You have to understand them. Now, during the Buddha's time, there were many views on the nature of life, ranging from spiritualistic soul theories embedded in elaborate theistic belief systems to a strikingly modern materialistic nihilism. The Buddha rejected all absolute soul theories, postulations of a rigidly fixed identity or static personal essence, with his cardinal doctrine of selflessness or soullessness, Anantama. Okay, so this is what the Buddha thought. He rejected the relative presence of a living self. He insisted on the continuity of the changeable, fluid soul from life to life. He explicitly rejected the contemporary nihilism that reduced even the relative conventional lived soul self or identity to a random epiphenomenon of matter. So he was not happy with the material understanding that you're just a random occurrence in the universe. He knew that there was a higher truth. There is a higher truth. The universal vehicle Mahayana Buddha scriptures, which became popular in India about 4 centuries after the Buddha's time, teach that a Buddha is a cosmic being whose state of achievement can be described as consisting of 3 bodies. First, a Buddha's perfect wisdom becomes a truth body, a body of ultimate reality. In that, an enlightened being experiences the whole universe as one with his or her own being. This is so profound. This is the ultimate teaching of yoga. When you understand and your own body as the ultimate reality, as the universe, as above so below. Second, a Buddha's perfect compassion becomes a form body, a limitless embodiment that reaches out from the enlightened being's blissful oneness with the ultimate reality of freedom to help countless other beings escape from suffering by realizing their own oneness with freedom. This form body is itself divided into 2. So this is real hardcore teachings of Buddha and all the teachings of Shakyamuni Buddha, which you can look into. The Buddha founded and greatly furthered the tradition of inner or mind science, Adhyatma Vidya. Okay, Adhyatmik Vidya in Sanskrit. It is science. Okay, it's not different from science. It's absolute science. And now moving on to Tibetan ideas about death. So the Tibetan attitude towards death and the between is neither mystical nor mysterious. This guidebook for the journey through the between shows how the reality of death fits into the Tibetan's world, vividly picturing the continuity between former, present, and future lives. Their multi-life perspective is no more and no less a religious belief system that our modern sense of the structure of the solar system or the patterns of the cycles of seasons in a year. Tibetans considered it a matter of common sense and scientific fact that animate beings exist along a continuum of lives, and that the death, between, and rebirth processes follow a predictable pattern. They have credible accounts by enlightened voyagers who have gone through the between experience consciously, preserved the memory, and reported their experiences. Tibetans accept these reports of their psychonauts just as we do those of astronauts who report what happened on the moon. Tibetans also believe that most people can recover memories of their former lives by a fairly elementary regime of meditation. Tibetans act on this Buddhist perspective in a practical manner, using their lifetimes to educate themselves to understand the world and to prepare for death and future lives by improving their ethical actions, emotional habits, and critical insight. Tibetans share the Western view of death in some ways, but it's very, very different. It's a tragedy, of course, at the end of life. Of course, the Tibetans see it, but they have methods for anticipating and warding off untimely death, for cheating even timely death, and for prolonging the precious human life. On this human level, they are even more afraid of death than we modern materialists or humanists who expect an automatic, painless death. The Tibetans are scared of death, like everybody. They see it as something more. Okay, they see an anesthetic oblivion as very improbable, understanding death rather as a door to transition that can be worse and fatally dangerous for those unprepared or badly misdirected by negative habits and attitudes. They thus naturally see death as a malevolent, powerful nihility that is lurking out there, that will come for them at any time. But they prepare themselves for it, okay? So, this is how the Buddhists look at death, alright? Tibetans are terrified of Yama, who's the Hindu god of death, and they look to the Buddhas and the Bodhisattvas to save them from judgment at his hands. They dramatize his presence at festivals and masquerades as a fierce deity who is danced by a giant monk wearing a terrifying mask and a colorful costume. He is always shown as ultimately tamed by the Buddha, by the wisdom Bodhisattva Manjushri, or by the compassion Bodhisattva Avalokiteshvara in the form of Padmasambhava, the great adept and first historical savior of Tibet. So death is personified, and the imagery, the Tibetan imagery is death, of death is very vivid. Okay. Now, the Tibetans believe that life is boundless, and we did not come out of nothing, and we cannot become nothing. We are both beginningless and endless. Since we will always be involved in the relational realm, we must know our inner freedom as well. If we do not and are forced in our ignorance to experience our inevitable involvement as an endless bondage, as a perpetual suffering, our lives will be boundless torment. Human life is characterized as being midway between states of excessive pain and states of excessive pleasure. So we are sort of in between, and that's what the Buddha emphasized, the Madhyam path, or the in between. A being assumes human rebirth from life in other forms by accumulating a vast amount of merit through deeds of giving, moral interacting and tolerating, and an equally vast amount of intelligence, through long efforts of developing critical wisdom and penetrating concentration. Wisdom and concentration are very important aspects of understanding your psyche. Okay, the human form is relatively free of rigidly programmed instinctual reactions. Thus, human beings are uniquely endowed with the ability and opportunity to understand fully their situation, reprogram themselves completely positively, and attain the unexcelled perfect enlightenment of Buddhahood. They can become boundlessly happy, alive, radiant, and helpful to other beings. To die unenlightened and lose the liberty and opportunity of human embodiment before attaining enlightenment, and then to be reborn involuntarily in extremely miserable conditions. Innumerable further times, this would be the ultimate tragedy. Once human life is understood as providing the liberty and opportunity for evolutionary freedom and altruistic enlightenment, its loss is far worse than is the loss of life, assumed to be either sheer obliteration into nothingness or secure passage to heaven. Do you understand what that means? This means that you have the power to achieve liberty, because freedom is your ultimate state. It's your state. It's what you've got to understand, that you are not going to become nothing at the end of life, or you're not just going to go to hell and be tortured or tormented, or just go to heaven and live with the angels. No, you can create awakening. You can travel to these realms without death. You can be an enlightened person. That's what the psychonauts do. That's what they do. They jump into the unconscious. It's something like expecting loss of life to result in a passage into hell or purgatory. This is a danger that's more than fatal. Okay, because hell is limitless torment. How can there be limitless torment? Life is a cycle. Everything is a cycle. Even the universe will end. Then how can the human soul be made to suffer like that, through eternity? That's just not very philosophical, not very spiritual, this concept of hell and heaven. And Blavatsky showed that so well in The Secret Doctrine. More on that later. Thus, the Tibetan sense of the beginningless and boundless nature of life, of beings, as endlessly reborn, does not palliate the fear of death at all. It lends an intensity to this life that is quite compelling. So now you are forced to concentrate at what life is all about. You're forced to look at the wave and to make it a particle. It's really what underlies the strong religiosity and spirituality of the Tibetans, which does not come from their environment of highland wastes and snowy mountains. On the more spiritual level, however, Tibetans have learned to view the ordinary fearsome death as a strong force close to life, a powerful impulse to the good, an intensifier of positive attitudes and actions. They tend not to get caught in the reification of death as a force of pure evil, some sort of radical, insensate, arbitrary malevolence. They rather learn to see it as non-existent, as a thing in itself apart from life. The sense of the relationality of even death encourages them to view death on the highest level as the immediate, omnipresent realm of freedom, not merely part of life, but the ground of life. So death becomes serious, becomes sacred, not something to be scared of, but something to face, something to learn about. Tibetans observe that anyone can die at any time in any place. Our sense of the concreteness of the life situation, of the solidity of the waking world of the five senses and their objects, is a complete error. Nothing that we think we do, we are, we feel, or have has any essence, substance, stability, or solidity. All the somethings in and around us with which we occupy ourselves from morning to night are potentially nothing to us. If we died, they would dissolve in our tightest grasp, forgotten if they were in our mind, lost if they were in our hand, faded into blank numbness if they were our mind and body, faded into blank numbness if they were our mind and body. Surprisingly, once we become accustomed to the omnipresent possibility of death in life, we feel greatly liberated. We realize we are essentially free at all times in all situations. We realize that our all compulsion is only based on the illusion of substantial continuation, enduring substance, binding essence. We become completely immersed in the medium of freedom. Our participation in relationalities is in reality totally voluntary. So we participate in life, that's why we create life. So reality is dependent on us. Consciousness creates reality. Now, if we understand that everything is an illusion, then we can really wake up from this illusion, People have noticed that Tibetan culture is highly colorful, that the Tibetans are, on the whole, a cheerful, vibrant, and lively lot. They are individualistic and unpredictable. They cherish freedom in all respects and on all levels. That's what happens when you abolish the military. That's what happens when you don't want to wage war. That's what happens when you become a psychonaut and explore your inner realm, right? They have used their independence to practice the enlightenment teachings of the Buddha, not just to develop materially or militarily. They have lived intelligently by their lights, have used human life well, and extracted its fullest potential for evolutionary, not just material progress. A great measure of the unique beauty of their civilization comes from their vivid awareness of the immediacy of death and the freedom that awareness brings. We've got to understand what is death, and that's what the second chapter deals with. Now, what is death? So this is about flatlining on the EEG, which is the cessation of heartbeat and brain activity, and that's what represents death. Now, the illusion of the subjective I in the individual consciousness, assumed by materialists to correspond with the presence of brainwave activity, should cease with the cessation of brainwaves. Yet the picture of death as a nothing in consciousness is not a scientific finding. It's a conceptual notion. There may be many cases of people being revived after flatlining for some time, and they report intense subjective experiences. These are what we know as the near-death experiences, or NDE. This is one of my favorite topics of research and study, NDE. What happens when you die a clinical death and you come back again in this 3D world? Where does your awareness go? In the popular imagination, which is developed by a modern scientific education, death is most often supposed to be a terminal state, a nothingness, an oblivion, a void that destroys life, that swallows it up forever. It is aligned with sleep, darkness, and unconsciousness. It is feared by those who feel happy or feel they should be happy. So we fear death as a society. I think everybody in the world fears death. Who doesn't? But if you understand the Bardo Thodol, and if you really look at all the concepts present in it, you understand death a bit better. And it doesn't get easy. Maybe it will not get easy for you, but you can understand it better. Okay, science should not neglect to question this picture. In fact, inner science begins with the analysis of nothingness. So what is this nothingness that we all fear? Okay, so when we have a lot of pain, and when get anesthesia, that bliss, that's almost blessed. I know what it feels like. I labored for 17 hours till I was given a local anesthesia to deliver. I know what that bliss is. So this nothingness, this nothing is, it's an idea. It's a place that involves area. It's an extension. It's defined by coordinates and boundaries. It's not nothing. It is room. Nothing has no room, nor can anything be located within nothing. Nothing cannot have an inside or an outside. It cannot destroy, swallow, or terminate. As nothing, it can have no energy or effect. As nothing, it cannot be a thing, a realm, a state, or anything. It's absolutely nothing to fear. It's nothing to hope for. This ultimate end of everything, this diametric opposite of all, is nothing in itself. And yet we think of nothing as something. Clearly, nothing is that conceptual entity that shows most clearly the illusory status of all conceptual entities. To use the verb exist about it is a misuse of language. To refer to nothing as it, this, that, or whatever without quotes is a mistake, as only the concept can be referred to. Nothing is categorically unimaginable, so it is incorrect to picture nothing as a destination. It is wrongly imagined to be the ground state giving off no reading, which appears as an EEG flatline. It's incoherently imagined to be an anesthesia following a loss of all sensation. It is wrongly conceived to be a place of quiet within which consciousness can slip. It cannot be entered. When we do imagine nothing in the above ways, we are actually doing nothing more than comforting ourselves. We are building our image of the state of nothingness on our habitual sense of deep sleep. We lose concerns, worries, sensations, and finally consciousness itself as we fall asleep. We fall asleep, having a sense of relaxing into a ground state. We may have a last moment of awareness of slipping away. We may have a first moment of waking up complete with a memory of having been in a dream, or less easily of waking up in a dream or losing consciousness out of a dream. These are lucid dreams, but we do not have any direct experience of being unconscious, so we cannot remember having been unconscious. Thus, our sense of having rested in a state of nothingness of consciousness is an inference based on the last and first moments of threshold awareness. We associate sleep with refreshment, rest, peace, and quiet. Someone with a mental or physical sickness who cannot sleep is considered to suffer torture, and sleep deprivation will destroy anyone's body before too long. Look at the Russian sleep experiments, and you'll know what sleep deprivation can do. We love sleep. Actually, sleep does not correspond with a flat line, absolute lack of brain activity. Our brains can be quite active during dreaming than in some waking states. Sleep is thus materialistically very different from the dead state of a corpse. When we imagine death as entry into nothingness, we are merely comforting ourselves. Our sense of death as a sleep is a mere analogy, even from a materialistic perspective. It is also likely that the dualistic model of liberation that motivates individual vehicle Buddhism and mystical forms of Hinduism, Taoism, and Western monotheism, a model of liberation as a state of absolute aloofness from the world of life is derived from this universal human experience of sleep. In most cultures, sleep is accepted as a blissful withdrawal into an aloof state of peace, a restful separation from troubles, worries, pains, and entanglements. So, religious ideals of nirvana, conceived as a state apart, ultimate liberation from pain and sorrows, or a supreme release, may be nothing but guaranteed states of permanent, gloriously unconscious sleep. When we see this equation, we can understand at once why materialists scoff at spiritual or religious forms of liberation. Why would they need it? They have always guaranteed themselves permanent rest. They have guaranteed nothingness waiting for them, attained without the slightest effort on their part, without ethical sacrifice, without realization, without developing any skill or knowledge. All they have to do is fall asleep, a skill they have already cultivated during thousands of nights. That provides them the guarantee of a restful nothing awaiting them after death. Do they have any credible evidence? No one has ever returned to report entry into nothingness. They have no recorder, no viewer, no extension of their senses into the subjectivity of a dead person. They cannot physically probe into the brain dead state of any being. They have no convincing description of nothingness, which obviously has no attributes. They have never observed even one material thing become nothing. Why should the energy reality of a state of awareness, be it even a minimal awareness of pure rest, be the exception to the laws of physics? That energy is conserved and only transformed. What makes the materialist believe so powerfully in the nothingness of that one energy continuum? So energy does not die, energy transforms. Okay, so that is what we need to understand with this, that energy, there's no dogmatic belief that you can hold about this. You cannot have nothingness at the end of death, because energy transforms. Where does your soul go? They've even proved that the human body actually loses a certain amount of weight at the time of death. That's supposedly the weight of the soul. So what is the soul but energy? We can't be rational and think that there's nothingness. There's a lot going on. Given the boundless interconnectedness of living forms, beginningless and endless, and spread throughout an infinity of space, the materialist picture of evolution as natural selection operating purposelessly yet efficiently developing life forms through random mutation from a definite beginning point within a finite theater of planetary environment needs some revision. So yeah, we've got to understand that we are not random aberrations. We didn't randomly pop up. Okay, so this is the psychological evolutionary story is the theory of karma according to the Buddhists. Okay, the karma theory describes a great chain of being, postulating a kinship between all observed species of beings. So this quantum entanglement, Buddha knew that. So there's everything is connected by karma. This quantum entanglement is held together by karma. The karmic evolution can be random, and beings evolve into lower forms as well as higher forms. Once beings become conscious of the process, however, they can purposely affect their evolution through choices of actions and thoughts. Although there are undeniable differences, the karma theory gives an evolutionary explanation how beings are the way they are. So this is what we've got to understand: the wheel of karma. Karma, it means action that causes development and change. So it is close to what is meant by evolution. Okay. So karma, Eastern thought also keep the term because they are thinking of karma mystically. But in Buddhist science, it has nothing to do with fate. It is an impersonal, natural process of cause and effect. Our karma at a given moment of life or death or the in between is the overall pattern of causal impulses resulting from former actions connected with our life continuum. These form a complex that impresses its effects on our bodies, actions, and thoughts. In turn, our ongoing actions of body, speech, and mind form new causal impulses which determine the nature and quality of our lives in the future. This complex can be called our evolutionary momentum. There's an old Tibetan saying, don't wonder about your former lives, just look carefully at your present body. Don't wonder about your future lives. Just look at your mind in the present. This expresses the sense that our present body has evolved from a long evolution driven by former actions, and our future embodiments will be shaped by how we think and what we decide to do in our present actions. The time of the between, the transition from a death to a new rebirth, is the best time to accept consciously to affect the causal process of evolution for the better. Our evolutionary momentum is temporarily fluid during the between, so we can gain or lose a lot of ground during its crises. So the Tibetans are highly aware of that, and that's why this book of natural liberation is such a guiding light, which can guide us on how we will make this transition and how we can use our time in this in-between realms to boost our evolutionary spiral. So it's imperative we use this book of natural liberation as a very important tool. Now join me for the next segment where I'll be discussing much more. Thank you.